Hello, my name is Carl Cranston. My mother told me that I was born 8/20/40, and I always liked the sound of that. It almost had a melodic ring to it. When I got to be about 10 years old, I needed a Social Security card, so we sent off for my birth certificate. Here it comes back, it says 8/21/40. My mother said, "That's wrong, it was 8/20. Personally, I'd prefer to believe my mother than the government, but just to keep them happy, legal documents, it's 8/21/40. I was born in a small town in Howell, Michigan, and we moved to Tucson, Arizona when I was 3 years old. And before I get into all of this, I'd like to make a short, shall we say, a disclaimer. We live in an age of politically correct speech, and I will express opinions, realities for me that are not necessarily those of management or the person viewing it. And I believe that everybody has a right to their own opinion, and that includes me. I happen to believe that you can be fabulously wealthy and totally destitute at the same time. I believe that you as a person can have two consciousnesses at the same time. I believe that you can emotionally be one part of you so high you could touch the sky, and another part of you so low that you can't reach up and grab a handle and flush. I also believe that there is a God who allows a person to travel their own path at their own speed. A God who does answer prayer. And in the figure of speech, that we're living a card game and He is the dealer, and that we come into this existence with just the cards that we've been dealt, and we have to play those cards. You can't cheat at this card game. And I believe that this God even gives the avowed atheist the right to believe that there is not a God. That's my beliefs. And I do believe that once you hear my story, even the atheist would have to agree that yes, Carl has no logical choice but to believe that there is a God that answers prayer. As I was saying, we moved to Tucson, Arizona when I was 3 years old. When we were 6 years old, we moved to a part of the Ozark Mountains in Missouri. The first place we lived at had no electricity, but it had a well with a pump handle, and my job was to pump the water and to split the firewood. At 7 years old, had a single-bladed axe, and I hated that axe, unwieldy and unbalanced. The second house that we lived at in Missouri had no electricity and no well. There's where I learned about Mr. Murphy and his law, because you see, it did have a spring at the bottom of the hill. So it was walk down the hill with a pole and 2 buckets that were empty, put water in them, and then walk back up the hill with the full buckets. When I was 8 years old, we moved to a small town in Northern California. The town was split by the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks. For the first year that we lived out there, I had the life of, shall we say, Huckleberry Finn. It was walk up the railroad tracks a half mile to the overpass or the trestle that went over Deer Creek, which was more like a river. It was a melted runoff from Mount Lassen, clear water, 35-foot trestle. Went up there with the town kids. We fished, we swam. They taught me how to swim. You know how that is with kids. Throw you out in the middle and you swallow half the water trying to get back to shore. That's how you learn to swim. We had fun one Saturday afternoon jumping off this trestle. We would go clear to the bottom and pop up out of the water like a champagne cork. Great fun until that night when my parents found out what we'd been doing and told the possible disaster if we'd have tried a belly whop. The next summer my father said, "You're running too much." Took me with him, hoed beans and corn for a local rancher, 10 hours a day, 5.5 days a week, got paid 25 cents an hour. That year with the money saved, I bought a Schwinn bicycle for $60, a bomber jacket for $18, and paid $25 to have my tonsils taken out in a doctor's office. When I was 11 years old, we moved back to Michigan, and there I worked on a baling crew for farmers. At that time, my nickname was Sawed Off because I was so short. I guess if somebody had told me, I would not have tried to stack bales 6 high on a wagon, but nobody told me, and besides, I was making $1 an hour. That was great wages. Up through high school, I continued to work for farmers, either after school or during the summertime. After I graduated from high school, eventually moved to Waukegan, Illinois. First job I applied for there was at Johns Manville. Luckily, they turned me down. The reason I says luckily, at that time, they were producing asbestos shingles. I got a job at Abbott Laboratories making drugs, ran a couple thousand-gallon stills, and knew that, or I soon realized that without a sheepskin at Abbott Laboratories, you were going in nowhere. Ran into a guy named Ed Weathers. He says, "You can talk good, I upholster good. Let's open an upholstery shop. You sell, I'll upholster." We rented a shop at 678 McAllister Street in Waukegan, Illinois. I continued to work midnight to 8:30 at Abbott Laboratories. Had no intentions of becoming an upholsterer of any kind. I might tear down furniture, but I knew nothing about upholstery. Well, a Greek restaurant owner there told me about the Lakeshore Country Club in Winnetka, Illinois, had 50 captains or 100 captain's chairs. They wanted upholstered. Why don't you go down and see them? Well, I drove down to Winnetka, Illinois in my 51 Oldsmobile 4-door sedan. Winnetka at that time had the highest per capita income of a city that size in the United States. Sold them 100 captain's chairs, $50 each. Rented a truck and hauled them back to Waukegan. The only problem was, about then, the realization was hitting me that my partner had to go across the street to the Welcome Tavern for breakfast, dinner, and supper. I got rid of a partner, but here I had all these chairs stacked up, and the way I was raised, you agree to do something, unless you're in the hospital, you do it. So I'm sitting there at a sewing machine that I'd borrowed money to buy, and an elderly gentleman, you know, he was 60, I was 21. When you're 21, 60 is really old. He watched me trying to teach myself how to sew for a half an hour, and finally he said, "Carl, a friendly piece of advice. There are only 2 kinds of people in the world, those that work with their heads and those that work with their hands. You're not of the latter. Watching you try to work with your hands reminds me of a monkey on an outhouse with boxing gloves trying to shingle." Well, with the ignorance and arrogance of youth, I told that old man what warm spot he could go to that I was going to learn. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that his assessment of me was quite correct, but somehow or other, I muddled through, got those chairs upholstered, collected the money, and then I ran into a fellow named Don Julius from Racine, Wisconsin, that ran a upholstery shop for Erickson Auto Trim out of Milwaukee. He said, "Why don't you do cars instead of furniture? They're a lot more fun, and besides, you don't have to carry metal frame hide-a-beds up 3 flights of stairs." Of course, he didn't tell me that a 55 Cadillac with a power seat was no lightweight. But I did that, started a business called Carl's Top and Trim at 512 South Sheridan. And there I learned how to put on convertible tops, make seat covers, and put carpets in and do inserts for car dealers. Acknowledgements, I should say thank you to every person who directly or indirectly has ever sent me work, and that includes the used car dealers whose favorite line was, "Carl, you gotta help me, I'm buried in this car." Also, it's been my privilege over the years to have worked with some fantastic auto restorers. The first one was a fellow named Mervyn Culver, aka Beaver. He had a restoration shop in Sturtevant, Wisconsin, did the high dollar classic cars. Another restorer was named Bobby Dennert from Skokie, Illinois, did primarily collector cars. And then the last restorer of note would be Frank Tetra from Rockledge, Florida, who has been primarily Cadillacs. Anyway, after being in business on Sheridan Road in Waukegan, Illinois in 1965, moved back to Michigan to try to make what was to be an ex-wife happy. Got a job at a local trim shop, working from 8 to 4 in the afternoons, would rush home, grab a bite, be to Fisher Body Oldsmobile by 4:42 in the afternoon, and work till 1:42 in the morning. That was my schedule during those years. Eventually quit Fisher Body, opened a trim shop in Jackson, Michigan. That was a flop, but I had some buddies from Illinois, brought a couple cars down for me to upholster. I did them. They said, "Come back to Waukegan," and nobody's doing custom work. In 1969, moved back to Waukegan, Illinois, rented a building at 1012 Washington Street, and coincidentally, our residence in Lansing was 512 South Magnolia. Anyway, had Carl's Customs on Washington Street, and eventually had a business relationship with Beaver in Sturtevant, Wisconsin. While I was in Washington Street, I did a lot of custom cars. One day a fellow came in and said, "I have a car, I want a different interior." At that time, everything was pleat and roll or diamonds, and I had no idea of how to design something totally different. I'm in my shop at 4 o'clock in the morning in a dark room trying to think up a design for an interior, and nothing is happening. I'm desperate. And finally I said, "God, please help me. I can't do this." I'm staring at a black wall in a totally dark room, and I see a pinpoint of light on that wall, and I thought, that's strange. And that light started coming towards me, getting bigger and brighter, bigger and brighter. And before it was done, I was totally enveloped by this bright white, pure white light. And then I felt totally at peace, total serenity, mother's love times 10, and I went to sleep at peace. Within the week, I had the design for that interior all in my head, did that car. It went on to win Best Custom Interior at McCormick Place in Chicago, and then was cover car and feature car in Rod Action magazine, January issue 1975. In 1974, I did my first car for Beaver, which was a 1929 Duesenberg Roadster, Durham body, one of a kind. This was the Bob Bear that owns the NASCAR track in Loudon, New Hampshire. This car went on to be cover car and feature car in a large book published by Automobile Quarterly. The next car that I did of note for Beaver was a 1931 Cadillac V16 Roadster, belonged to a gentleman named Richard Gold from Minneapolis, Minnesota. This 31 Cadillac V16 Roadster was one of two known to exist in the world. Dick Gold had a great collection. He had sold one of his Duesenbergs to Tom Monahan of Domino's Pizza, Detroit Tigers, for $1 million. This car showed at Henry Ford's Fairlane Estate in Dearborn, Michigan, 1977, July 9th. The next car that I did of note for Beaver was a 1929 Duesenberg LeBaron body dual cowl Phaeton. This car won Best in Show at the Crawford Aviation Museum first in the spring, and then at Pebble Beach in California. In 1979, I terminated the relationship with Beaver and started manufacturing the seating interior for the Excalibur automobile, manufactured in West Allis, Wisconsin. And from then until 1987, we did the complete interiors for the Excalibur automobile. It ended up going bankrupt, and so did I. I knocked around the Chicago area for 5 years, working for Chris Nurstheimer, Classic Car Upholster, ran the trim shop at a limousine manufacturing company for a year, and eventually, through a gentleman that I had met in the business from North Carolina named Lewis Jenkins, May 29th of 1992, I moved to North Wilkesboro, North Carolina, where we did primarily Buicks and Cadillacs. Collector cars, I was there for 13 and a half years and then retired out of there in the year 2005, moved 100 miles north to the mountains of Southwest Virginia, and have been there ever since, doing primarily collector cars, Buicks, Cadillacs. Have done, since I've been there, 16 53 Eldorados interiors for 7 people from Australia and the remainder from the USA. That's a very valuable collector car. I still enjoy what I do, and I'm thankful every day that I can get up, get out of bed, and go play again. Eventually, I ended up, as I said before, moving to North Carolina, May 29th, 1992, based upon promises that were never kept. By September 14th, 1993, I had a great deal of anger towards this individual in North Wilkesboro, North Carolina, because I knew he was not going to keep any of his promises. 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm working with my son. I feel something really wrong. I said, you better call 911. I ended up having a massive heart attack. My son beat the ambulance to the hospital. The sirens and lights were not going. They hit me with the paddles in the lot before they took me inside. The next thing I remember is one of me was up above laughing at the me on the table and saying, "Man, do you look funny?" A nurse was holding me down, trying to keep the oxygen mask on my face. There was 2 other nurses and a doctor trying to hang on to me. I'm fighting to get this 10-ton truck off my chest. And the one on the table said to the one up above, "Yeah, but she's smothering me. I can't breathe." The next thing I know, I'm in the black, traveling in the back. I'm going to the light. And when I got to the light, again, I felt the same ultimate and peace, serenity, and mother's love times 10. And I'm looking in this room of pure white light. And I remember it looked like a black door at the right-hand side. And it starts coming this way, and it speeded up. And I remember I wanted to hang on to that feeling. I'm looking. And then, like that, it was like the sound of jailhouse doors clanging shut. And I was back in my body.